The galaxy had rules older than most stars. Civilizations rose, expanded, and either proved their worth or were erased. The Galactic Council did not negotiate with uncertainty. It categorized, calculated, and acted. Every species discovered was reduced to data, potential, threat level, resource value. Humanity's entry into that system lasted less than a single rotation of Earth before the verdict was delivered. Primitive. Divided. Predictably violent. Their conclusion wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. Humanity's broadcasts had been monitored for decades. Wars, political conflicts, economic collapses, endless internal struggle. To the Council, it was obvious. A species that could not unify itself would never stand against something greater. It would fold, fracture, and surrender long before extinction became necessary. So they sent a message. It arrived across every channel simultaneously: satellites, military frequencies, civilian networks, even devices never meant to receive external transmissions. The signal was flawless, translated instantly into every known human language. No distortion. No delay. No room for misunderstanding. Surrender your planetary resources. Accept administrative control. Comply with integration protocols. Failure to comply will result in planetary sterilization. There was no introduction. No identity given. Just authority embedded in every word, as if the universe itself had already agreed with the outcome. For the first time in its history, Earth reacted as one, but not with unity. Not at first. Panic spread faster than comprehension. Governments scrambled to verify what could not be denied. Military commands raised alert levels that had never been designed for something beyond Earth. Civilian populations stared at screens, unable to decide whether this was a hoax or the final chapter of their existence. The skies remained unchanged, which somehow made it worse. No ships visible. No explosions. Just silence after the message, like a pause before something inevitable. Experts spoke. Analysts debated. Religious leaders interpreted. Politicians attempted reassurance. None of it mattered. The message had been too precise, too overwhelming in its certainty. This was not an invasion in progress. It was a demand issued by something that had already calculated the outcome. The deadline was clear. Comply, or be erased. Across the planet, something else began to shift. Beneath the fear, beneath the chaos, there was recognition. Not of the threat, but of the tone. Humanity had heard this before, in different forms, across centuries. Empires, dictators, conquerors, voices that claimed inevitability, that assumed submission as the natural response. And every time, history had answered differently. Not with immediate unity. Not with perfection. But with resistance that refused to disappear. The Council did not understand that part. Their models were built on logic, on patterns that repeated across species. They had seen civilizations collapse under less pressure than this. They expected the same outcome. Internal divisions would intensify. Leadership would fracture. Competing interests would paralyze any coordinated response. They were not wrong about what humanity was. They were wrong about what humanity became when pushed to the edge. The hours passed. Then days. The world did not end. No second message came. No visible fleet darkened the sky. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, as if waiting for Earth to break first. Behind that silence, decisions were being made. Not publicly. Not with speeches or declarations. Quiet, controlled, and absolute. Systems were repurposed. Protocols activated that had never been used. Lines that once divided nations began to blur, not out of trust, but out of necessity. The Council watched all of it. They observed increased data traffic, unusual coordination patterns, spikes in activity across military and technological sectors. To them, it looked exactly like what they expected, a species scrambling in its final moments, trying to delay the inevitable. They had seen it countless times. Desperation always looked the same from a distance. The deadline approached. Across Earth, no unified broadcast was prepared. No formal reply drafted. No attempt was made to negotiate, to plead, or to argue for survival. The channels remained open, waiting, just as the Council intended. The final moment arrived. And Earth answered. Not with defiance. Not with surrender. With nothing at all. No signal. No message. No acknowledgement. Just silence. To the Council, it confirmed everything. Fear had taken hold. Leadership had failed. The species had chosen denial over action. The outcome was already decided. What they didn't understand, what their calculations couldn't account for, was that silence, for humanity, had never meant surrender. Sometimes it meant the opposite. It meant the decision had already been made. The silence was logged, analyzed, and filed as compliance delay. The Council had encountered it before, species that froze when faced with extinction, buying time with inaction while their structures collapsed internally. There was no need for immediate escalation. A demonstration would be enough to end it. A small enforcement fleet was dispatched. Not an invasion force, not even a fraction of what the Council could deploy. Just enough to enter orbit, disable key systems, and remind the planet that refusal was not an option. Precision over excess. Efficiency over spectacle. From their perspective, the outcome was already settled. On Earth, the silence held, but it was no longer empty. Beneath it, everything moved. Communication lines that once carried conflict now carried coordination. Nations that had spent decades opposing each other began sharing data without negotiation. Not because they trusted one another, but because the alternative no longer existed. Survival replaced politics. Urgency erased hesitation. The first priority was understanding the enemy. The transmission that had delivered the ultimatum became a blueprint. Every frequency, every modulation, every embedded pattern was dissected. It wasn't just a message, it was a system, and systems could be studied, broken, repurposed. Humanity had always been good at that. Research facilities that once competed began operating as a single network. Theoretical models were tested in hours instead of years. Failures were ignored unless they provided usable data. Successes were immediately scaled, distributed, weaponized. There was no time for perfection. Orbital infrastructures shifted quietly. Satellites adjusted positions under the guise of routine correction. Civilian networks masked military intent. What had once been tools for communication and observation were redefined with a single purpose: utility in conflict. On the surface, manufacturing changed pace. Civilian production slowed. Strategic output surged. Components designed for entirely different industries were redirected, modified, assembled into systems that had never existed before. Improvised but functional. Humanity did not wait to match the enemy. It prepared to exploit it. The enforcement fleet entered the system without resistance. Their arrival was precise, controlled, exactly as planned. They encountered no defensive formations, no outward sign of readiness. Earth remained quiet, transmissions unchanged, no attempt at contact. To the Council, it confirmed the model. The species had chosen passivity. The fleet established orbit and began initial operations. Scans mapped the planet in detail. Key satellites were identified, categorized, and targeted for shutdown. It was a standard procedure: remove awareness, limit coordination, isolate the population. The first wave of interference began. Across Earth, signals flickered. Communication networks experienced disruptions. Satellites went dark one by one, cleanly disabled with methods far beyond anything humanity had anticipated just days before. From orbit, it looked like control being established. From the ground, it looked like the beginning of the end. And then it stopped. Not the interference. The reaction. There was no widespread collapse. No breakdown in coordination. Systems that should have failed entirely continued operating in altered states. Redundancies activated instantly, rerouting through pathways that had not existed before. Improvised networks replaced destroyed ones faster than the fleet could eliminate them. The silence adapted. The fleet adjusted its approach, increasing precision, targeting deeper layers of infrastructure. This time, the response came, not in words, but in timing. Every action taken against Earth began to produce a pattern. Every disruption triggered a countermeasure that wasn't reactive, but prepared. The delays were too short. The adjustments too exact. This was not a species improvising under pressure. This was a system waiting to be engaged. On Earth, there was no announcement. No declaration of resistance. The absence of communication was intentional, maintained with discipline that had never existed on a global scale before. Information was shared internally, instantly, but nothing was broadcast outward. The enemy would learn nothing that wasn't shown to them. As the fleet prepared to disable another layer of orbital assets, something shifted again, subtle, but measurable. Objects that had been categorized as inactive adjusted trajectory. Signals that had been dismissed as noise aligned into structure. Patterns emerged where there should have been randomness. The fleet registered the changes, flagged them as anomalies, and continued operations. They did not recognize preparation. They did not recognize intent. On Earth, the waiting ended. The moment the next strike began, the response was already in motion. The instant the next disruption command was executed from orbit, the response triggered without hesitation. It did not resemble defense. It was not an attempt to restore what had been lost. It was an attack, calculated down to the second, initiated across every layer of Earth's remaining infrastructure. Satellites previously marked as inactive came alive all at once. Their orbits had been adjusted long before the fleet arrived, subtle corrections that meant nothing in isolation but formed a precise lattice when viewed together. At the exact moment alien systems committed to another wave of shutdowns, those satellites overloaded their own cores and accelerated beyond safe limits. They did not evade targeting. They moved directly into it. The first collision was not an accident. It was an equation solved in motion. A kinetic impact at orbital velocity tore through one of the smaller vessels before its defensive systems could recalibrate. The fleet registered the loss as a malfunction, until the second impact followed, then the third, each one timed with unnatural precision. Confusion spread through alien command channels. Their models had not included deliberate self-destruction as a primary tactic. They adapted quickly, rerouting power, recalibrating shields, isolating affected sectors. But adaptation required time, and humanity had already moved past the first phase. Electromagnetic bursts followed the impacts, not from dedicated weapons, but from the remains of what had just been destroyed. Satellites rigged to collapse in specific ways released concentrated interference fields that rippled across nearby ships. Systems flickered. Targeting arrays desynchronized. Internal communications lagged by fractions of a second that, in combat, became critical. The fleet attempted to regain control of the engagement, shifting from suppression to containment. They began targeting the objects before they could reach optimal proximity, firing on anything that deviated from predictable patterns. That assumption failed immediately. Nothing moved predictably. Humanity did not rely on a single coordinated system. It relied on thousands of independent ones, each operating with incomplete data but a shared objective. When one pathway was blocked, another formed without waiting for instruction. When one method failed, the next was already in motion. There was no central point to disable, no command structure to collapse. The sky above Earth transformed into something the fleet had never encountered, an environment where every object, active or inert, could become a weapon without warning. Fragments of destroyed satellites were redirected using minimal propulsion, guided into trajectories that intersected with vulnerable points in alien formations. Civilian infrastructure, repurposed without hesitation, contributed to the chaos. Communication relays became jamming sources. Navigation systems fed false vectors into enemy sensors. Even debris fields were no longer random. They were shaped, influenced, turned into barriers and traps. The first confirmed destruction of a capital ship forced a reassessment. Its shielding had not failed under direct assault. It had been compromised from within its own operational limits, overwhelmed by simultaneous disruptions that no model had predicted could occur together. For the first time, the fleet understood it was under coordinated attack. Not resistance. Not desperation. Strategy. On the ground, the change was immediate. The uncertainty that had dominated the early hours was replaced by something sharper. The enemy could be damaged. Not theoretically, not eventually, now. Every successful strike reinforced the same realization across the planet. They were not invincible. That belief spread faster than any signal. The fleet attempted to regroup, pulling back into tighter formations, prioritizing defense over continued suppression. It was the correct response against most adversaries. Against humanity, it created a new vulnerability. Clusters became targets. Humanity adjusted instantly. Attacks that had been dispersed became focused. Multiple systems converged on single points, overwhelming defenses not through superior power, but through relentless pressure applied from unpredictable angles. There was no pause between waves, no attempt to conserve resources for a prolonged engagement. Everything was used as soon as it became available. Losses mounted on both sides, but only one side recalculated its expectations. The Council's models had predicted compliance within hours, collapse within days. Instead, they received fragmented reports of vessels disabled, formations disrupted, and systems behaving in ways that defied established parameters. Earth remained silent throughout. No transmissions. No demands. No declarations of intent. Only action. As the fleet stabilized its position and prepared a more aggressive countermeasure, something became clear within their command structure. This was not an isolated response triggered by fear. It was prepared in advance, executed with precision, and escalating with every exchange. Humanity was not reacting to the attack. It had been waiting for it. And now that it had begun, there was no indication it intended to stop. The First Fleet's disruption forced the Council to abandon restraint. What had been classified as a minor enforcement action was redefined as an active conflict. Additional forces were mobilized immediately, larger, heavier, designed not to demonstrate authority but to impose it without resistance. When the second wave entered the system, it did not arrive quietly. Space around Earth filled with signatures too numerous to ignore, formations layered with redundancy, command ships shielded behind multiple defensive tiers. This was no longer an assumption of victory. It was an attempt to guarantee it. Humanity did not respond with hesitation. The systems that had been used in the initial strike were not reused in the same way. Patterns were discarded as soon as they became recognizable. What had worked once was already considered compromised. Adaptation was not a phase, it was continuous. Orbital space became dense with controlled chaos. Debris from earlier engagements was no longer a byproduct, it was integrated into strategy. Fragments were redirected into drifting minefields, invisible until impact. Larger wreckage was manipulated into moving cover, breaking line of sight, forcing the invading fleet to navigate an environment that shifted faster than their calculations could stabilize. The Council's forces relied on precision and predictability. Their formations were designed to minimize variables, to ensure that every movement could be anticipated and countered. Humanity introduced variables faster than they could be measured. Missile systems were deployed not for direct hits, but to alter positioning. Detonations occurred where they would reshape the battlefield rather than destroy targets outright. Shockwaves nudged vessels into unstable trajectories, creating openings that did not exist seconds before. Each adjustment compounded the next, turning controlled space into something unstable. The invading fleet responded with overwhelming force. Sections of orbit were cleared through concentrated fire, entire zones rendered empty in seconds. It was efficient, brutal, and effective, until humanity moved back into those spaces immediately, using the absence itself as an advantage. There was no concept of safe distance anymore. Human vessels, improvised, uneven, not designed for sustained combat, closed gaps that should have been avoided. They operated within ranges the Council considered tactically unsound, sacrificing durability for proximity. At close range, advantages shifted. Precision systems designed for distant engagement struggled to adapt. Reactions slowed. Targeting became imperfect. Humanity accepted those margins. Losses increased. Ships were destroyed in numbers that would have broken most fleets. But each loss was calculated into the larger exchange. Every destroyed vessel created debris, interference, disruption. Nothing was wasted. Even failure was converted into pressure. The Council began to recognize a pattern they had not encountered before. Humans did not disengage when outmatched. They intensified. Every escalation met with another, faster and less predictable. There was no threshold where they would stabilize or withdraw. They advanced. Command structures within the invading fleet adjusted again, isolating key assets, reinforcing the central flagship, and attempting to draw the conflict into a controlled perimeter. If the battle could be contained, variables could be reduced. Humanity allowed that containment. At first, engagements narrowed. Attacks became more focused, less dispersed. To the Council, it appeared as adaptation to pressure, a sign that the opposing force was beginning to conform to predictable limits. It was not. The concentration of forces was intentional, a gradual compression of the battlefield toward a single point. Every retreat, every redirected strike, fed into that movement. The flagship remained protected, its defenses layered, its position stable within the shrinking perimeter. Until it wasn't. The surrounding space, saturated with debris, interference, and residual energy from countless engagements, became unstable in ways the Council had not modeled. Sensors degraded. Shield harmonics fluctuated. Communication latency increased beyond acceptable thresholds. That instability had been built over time. Humanity moved through it without slowing. Multiple vectors converged on the flagship simultaneously, not in a single overwhelming strike, but in staggered waves that forced continuous recalibration. Each defense raised against one threat exposed vulnerability to another. Each adjustment created delay. For the first time, the flagship's systems registered cumulative failure. Around it, the fleet attempted to reassert control, redirecting fire, closing ranks, eliminating anything within range. The response was immediate, powerful, and late. Human forces did not withdraw. They pressed closer. Not because it was optimal, but because it was decisive. The Council had expected resistance. It had not expected pursuit. What they faced was not a species trying to survive. It was a species trying to end the fight on its own terms. The pressure on the flagship did not break all at once. It accumulated, layer by layer, until stability became impossible to maintain. Defensive systems cycled beyond safe thresholds, recalibrating faster than they were designed to handle. Shield integrity fluctuated, not from a single overwhelming strike, but from continuous disruption applied with precision. Humanity did not attempt a decisive blow in the conventional sense. Instead, it removed the conditions that allowed the flagship to remain untouchable. Interference fields distorted targeting accuracy. Debris streams limited maneuverability. Coordinated strikes forced defensive prioritization, each one drawing energy and attention away from another vulnerability. The flagship adapted, as it had been designed to do. It rerouted power, isolated damaged systems, and prepared a countermeasure intended to clear the surrounding space entirely. A single action, calculated to reset the battlefield. It never completed. The delay was minimal, fractions of a second, but it was enough. A sequence of impacts, individually insufficient, aligned at the exact point where recalibration had left a gap. The shields did not collapse instantly. They destabilized, losing cohesion just long enough for the next wave to pass through unimpeded. What followed was not an explosion that ended everything at once. It was a controlled failure spreading through interconnected systems. Power conduits overloaded. Internal synchronization broke. Sections of the vessel ceased operating in coordination with the rest. For the first time, the flagship was no longer a singular entity. It was a collection of failing parts. The surrounding fleet responded immediately, shifting into emergency protocols, attempting to shield and extract their central command. Fire intensified, clearing space around the damaged vessel, eliminating anything that could threaten it further. Humanity did not retreat. The attacks continued, not with desperation, but with consistency. Each strike applied pressure to a system already compromised, accelerating a process that could no longer be reversed. There was no pause to reassess, no attempt to negotiate advantage. The objective had narrowed to a single outcome. End it. The final rupture came from within. Systems designed to regulate energy flow failed to compensate for the imbalance. Containment broke. What had once been controlled output became uncontrolled release. The flagship disintegrated under its own mechanisms, its structure unable to withstand the cascade it had been forced into. Silence followed, but it was different from before. Not the absence of action, but the absence of certainty. The remaining fleet did not advance. It did not attempt to continue the engagement with the same momentum. Calculations shifted rapidly, accounting for losses that had not been considered possible. Projections that had once guaranteed success now produced unacceptable risk. For the first time, the Council faced a variable it could not resolve. Continuation no longer ensured victory. Across Earth, the conflict did not end with celebration. There was no signal marking triumph, no broadcast declaring success. The systems that had sustained the fight remained active, tracking, adapting, preparing for the next movement. Damage assessments were ongoing, losses acknowledged without pause in operation. Survival had not created relief. It had created awareness. The fleet began to withdraw in stages, controlled and deliberate, maintaining defensive posture while increasing distance. It was not a rout. It was a recalculation in motion, a recognition that further engagement would escalate beyond acceptable limits. Humanity did not pursue beyond a certain threshold. The boundary was not spoken, but it was understood. The objective had been achieved. The message did not require expansion. For the first time since the initial transmission, Earth sent a signal. It contained no language, no translation, no structure that resembled communication as the Council defined it. Instead, it transmitted data, coordinates, telemetry, recorded sequences of the engagement. Not explanations, not threats. Evidence. A complete record of what had occurred, delivered without interpretation. The Council received it and understood. This was not a species that needed to declare its intent. It demonstrated it. It did not rely on negotiation to define its position. It enforced it through action, adapting faster than prediction, escalating without hesitation, and refusing to conform to expected limits. Earth remained in place, damaged but intact, its systems still active, its silence restored. The classification changed. Not primitive. Not divided. Unpredictable. High risk. Not to be engaged without full commitment. The galaxy adjusted around that conclusion. Humanity did not respond. It had already said everything it needed to.